Okay, welcome to lecture for research methods. We'll be talking just a little bit about reviewing research, so reading research articles, mainly for the purpose of doing a literature review. So a few things. Picking an article. We've already talked about strategies for searching, but once you've got some results, you're trying to figure out, of the 600 hits you got or 2,000 hits, depending on your search, how do you pick which ones you really want to are going to be important and useful to you? Well, obviously, the first place to start would be the title, right? Because a good title tells you what the key variables in the study are and what kind of relationship is being looked at. You always want to keep an eye out for, if it says the effect of, or if it just says the relationship between, and that'll give you an idea of what the study is like, if it's experimental or correlational, and what kind of information will be provided. And you also need to, often looking at the title, you can tell whether or not it was a study or not, or if it says, a theoretical review of, okay, well then they didn't collect any data. They're just talking about ideas, which may be important to you, and may be useful to you in writing your introduction section. But it's not the same thing as a study where they collected data, and you can usually figure that out, what type of article it is, from the title. Another thing to look at is the source. Right, and on PsycInfo, at least now, they have a little icon that will tell you if it is an empirical article, a professional journal, and usually if you use PsycInfo, it won't bring up hits from non-professional journals. But one thing it will bring up is dissertations. And dissertations often explore really interesting topics, but they're rarely cited in other manuscripts. And they're not cited typically because if somebody does a really good study for their dissertation and they're somebody who wants to do research, they're going to get it published in a regular journal in addition to being published as a dissertation. So people will wait till it's published in a peer-reviewed journal, because dissertations have been reviewed by a committee, but they didn't go through the peer review process like other published articles in professional journals typically are. So you might read dissertations to get some ideas, but it's usually not going to be stuff that you're going to be able to cite. Okay. Then obviously, if you say, okay, this is a good source, and the title looks interesting, rather than read the article, start with the abstract, right? Because the abstract is the article in a nutshell. And typically what I do when searching is, if the abstract looks good, I won't go to the article yet. I'll put that abstract to the side, and in PsycInfo and other EBSCO host databases, there's all kinds of things you can do where you can put them in folders and save citations, and then export them to your email or a Word document or whatever. So I usually do that, and then go back later after it, because once you get on the roll finding stuff, you want to keep going. Then go back and look at those abstracts and say, okay, of the ones I picked out, which ones are really going to be good? But so I have kind of looser criteria when at the initial run. Okay, this abstract looks okay. It's a maybe. It goes in the maybe pile, and then later I'll go back and read the articles and decide if it's a keeper or not. The other thing, if you're looking, well, the abstract looks good, but I'm really not sure if I even want to keep this abstract, and you want to go ahead and look at the article. If you're going to look at the article, the best place to get relevant information without having to read the whole thing is skipping down the discussion section and looking at the first paragraph in the discussion, because this is where typically the authors will say in plain English what was found in their study. They'll say, consistent with our expectations, we found that blah blah blah, and that's usually the heart of what you're looking for, is what the results of their study in plain English, and you can find it there. And then if it's relevant to what you need, you can go back and read the rest of the article. So when you go back and read the rest of the article, okay, hello computer. There we go. Hard drive failure, lovely. Anyway, so what should you look for in the introduction section? A couple of things. One, the question that they're looking at. Why is it important? Did they make a good case for its relevance? Right? And it may be something. If they looked at a question similar to yours, it may be, oh yeah, I can use that same reasoning. I'm gonna steal their ideas. But of course, you're not going to steal, because you're going to cite appropriately, and therefore it's not stealing. What do they think the answer to the question is? So that's basically, what is their hypothesis, right? And be sure to look at articles that you agree with in terms of what they think the answer is, and also those that you disagree with. So if you're predicting one thing and other people have gone and predicted the opposite, don't say, "Oh, well, that's the opposite I'm doing, so I'm not interested." Look at both sides, because ignoring research that runs counter to what you'll be trying to propose only weakens your argument in the eyes of others. Another piece of information that's typically there and you want to look at is why do they think they're right, so the justification for their hypothesis. What theory or theories are they using? If it's not one you're familiar with, read up on it. That's one of the reasons that they cite sources. You say, wow, how will I ever find out more about this theory? Well, they cited some article or some book. And oftentimes when people are talking about theories, they'll cite a book, and you go, oh man, it's going to be a pain in the tuchus to get that book. If our library doesn't have it, it'll take me forever. I might as well give up. Not necessarily. Usually the author that wrote that book or that chapter also wrote some theoretical articles, and you'll be able to find those. So just do a search for that author's name, and you'll find some more information on that theory if you can't easily find the book that's being cited. They'll probably also be citing previous research findings to support their position, and when you're reading that, don't assume that the research they're citing is 100% valid. So if they say, oh, so-and-so already found blah, blah, blah. Okay, and if you go, well, gee, that doesn't sound right. If it doesn't sound right, if it sounds fishy or it runs counter to what you're looking for, go back and look, right? Go to that source that they're citing, read the article for yourself, and see if there are kind of weaknesses or limitations to that study that invalidate the conclusions that are being drawn. Okay. Fortunately, another thing that they should do is indicate why they might be wrong. So why might their hypotheses not be supported? So just like you shouldn't present only one side of the story, the authors of the articles you read shouldn't either. So when you're reading these arguments, what do you think about the reasons that they give? Did they consider everything? And so, well, we may not find it because of this and this, and you might say, oh, you didn't mention this, so that might be important. And then look and see, well, did somebody else look at another reason that you thought of when reading their work? And then obviously, how did they look for the answer? Right, so it's kind of method stuff. And method, this is intro. But yeah, a brief overview of the method is typically given near the end of the introduction section, where you're kind of giving the reader a heads up. Okay, and here's this question, and here's how we looked at it. Conducted surveys, did a clinical trial, whatever. And then the other thing that they might do is address why their method for finding the answer was the right method. Right? And articles will vary in regards to how much time they spend doing this. They'll spend more time doing it if they're introducing a method that hasn't been previously applied to a particular topic. If it's the first time a study's ever looked at some question using face-to-face interviews, then they'll talk about the advantages of face-to-face interviews versus paper and pencil interviews. Right? But if it's a method that's been done a million times, then they probably won't spend too much time justifying it. When you get to the method section, what to look for, and you can usually kind of skim through the method. Every word isn't necessarily important unless you're trying to replicate or looking for some specific information. But basic stuff you want to look for, who was in the study, the participant section, and you want to know about how many, and that's relevant to something we'll talk about later in terms of statistical power, the power to find an effect. So there should be enough people in the study, and how many is enough depends on how many variables you're using and what kind of test you're doing, and we'll get to that later. Then other things you need to know about who's in the study, the characteristics of the sample, so which speaks largely to generalizability, external validity, but also may impact some internal validity issues. And then what happened to the people in the study? What did they experience? They just fill out measures. Did the experiments do stuff to them? Then related to that, what are the key variables? Your independent variable and dependent variable, or criterion predictor variables. And what you want to pay attention to there is how are they operationalized? So you say you're looking at aggression. Well, how did they operationally define aggression? And then you should be thinking, okay, what's the impact of doing it that way? And do I agree with it? Is that really a good representation of this construct? Did they measure the variable fairly or in a way that's meaningful to what I'm trying to talk about? Or is there something about the way they measured it that is probably going to influence their findings and maybe make it like my findings or different than my findings? and then of course what type of design was used. And generally we can break it down into experimental or correlational design at a kind of a broad level, but there are also other types of designs, factor analysis and other kind of qualitative stuff. But generally, you want to know, were they looking at cause-effect stuff, or were they looking at just association type stuff? Because that's going to affect the conclusions that they should be drawing. And you want to say, okay, if they didn't do an experiment, they shouldn't be, when I get to the discussion, talking about A caused B. Right? So make sure that the design and the conclusions match up. Okay. The results section, you want to look at what data or scores were analyzed. Maybe they, in the method section, they said they gave the MMPI-2, and it generates all these different subscale scores. Well, which subscale scores did they look at, and did they throw any out? Because sometimes they'll say, well, such and such was analyzed after eliminating outliers. So participants that scored, if 2 or 3 scored really high and 2 or 3 scored really low, they may eliminate those before looking at the data. So you want to look at what they did with data to kind of clean it up. And you need to be thinking, okay, did they treat the data fairly, or did their data cleanup method or their way of picking which scores to look at, unfairly bias the outcome in favor of what they expected? So keep an eye out for that kind of thing. Obviously, what type of analysis or analyses were used? It's ANOVA, regression, correlation, factor analysis, path analysis, chi-square, or dozens of other different things. But the big ones were going to be your ANOVA and different types of ANOVA, regression, different types of regression, and then basic correlations. But in general, the analyses are either going to be looking at group differences with stuff like ANOVA and t-tests. So was this group more or less than this group? Or they might be looking at relationships. So were high scores on one variable reliably associated with high or low scores on some other variable? And here we're talking about correlation and regression stuff. Or they might have been trying to look at groupings of people or responses. Looking at the whole sample, or all the answers on a survey, and seeing, are there similarities where I can group, okay, well, all these answers are alike like this, and these questions that people answered are alike, but they're different than these questions, and you group things like that, and that's basically what factor analysis is. Or we might be looking at a large group of people, how they answered questions, and if a bunch of people, there's some group of people, all these people answered the same way, but here's this other group of people, and they answered in a different way, and now I'm doing maybe cluster analysis. Right, and that's another approach. Or might be doing qualitative research, and with qualitative research, typically the data you're looking at is not numerical, right? It's not quantitative, not stuff you can add and subtract. So often it's stuff like some sort of narrative description. So what clients said, or descriptions of observations of participants. Right, and the level of analysis involved in qualitative research varies, and often it involves looking for patterns or themes that emerge from the data, and you can use kind of fairly subjective analysis. We looked at everybody's descriptions of their dreams, and we found that a lot of people mentioned dreams seem to represent either fear or affiliation, right? And maybe they use a bunch of raters, a bunch of experimenters to do that, and they calculated inter-rater reliability. Or there's also some computer programs that can do that kind of stuff now. Or they may get a little more quantitative and kind of convert qualitative data into numerical format. It just depends on the study. Another thing you'd be looking for is, were the findings statistically significant? We still rely on null hypothesis statistical testing in our field, moving to include other things, but still that. So you want to know about statistical significance. But then there's a big push now to also look at effect sizes and confidence intervals. The problem is sometimes people, well, okay, they reported an effect size of 0.3. Is that good or bad? And some say, oh, well, you can look at what Cohen said for small, medium, and large effect sizes. But that kind of misses the point, because effect sizes aren't these absolute things where, okay, this is always big, this is always small. It depends on what you're looking at and what previous research has found. Fortunately, if it's a well-written article, they'll give you the context. They'll say, we found an effect size of 0.3. This is consistent with effects done using similar research protocols with a different treatment. So then you say, okay, well, this treatment is about as effective as another treatment because we're getting the same effect size, or a larger effect size, or a smaller effect size, and you can compare them that way. But again, effect sizes should always be interpreted in terms of what's the typical effect size. What have other people found using either the same method or looking at the same problem? And then, of course, you should be looking for whether or not the pattern of results was supportive of their hypotheses or not, and they should say that really directly. Now, kind of a side note here: the results section can be hard to read, especially if they use some complicated statistical procedures. And for me, I usually just skim the results section unless I figure out that I'm really interested in the conclusions the authors drew. If either I really agree with them or I disagree with them, now I'm going to go back and say, okay, well, now let me try to now I'm going to work hard to try to understand what they said in the results section. Until then, I'm going to kind of skip that and move on to the discussion where the more interesting stuff is, and stuff that's easier to figure out what they're saying. But because it can be difficult to read this section, this is often where the weaknesses of a study may go unnoticed. Right? Sometimes the conclusions drawn can't be justified because of the way the data were analyzed, and so for that reason, it is important to go back. If the conclusions are important or relevant to you, it is important to look at this closely and figure out, okay, well, can what they're saying really be supported by the way they looked at the data, or is there something biased in their data analysis procedure? And don't be embarrassed about asking us to help you understand the statistical gobbledygook, because that's what a lot of it is. It seems like gobbledygook. It's a different language, and the only way to learn that language is to practice using it and to talk to others about it. So asking people for help is fine in terms of trying to figure out the results section, and the more you ask and get help, the less you'll need help in the future. Okay. Then the final section, of course, is the discussion section. Here's where, again, we're looking at, was the pattern of findings consistent with expectations, which we might have gotten from the results. Sometimes the results have so many numbers in kind of weird words and phrases we understand that we can't really figure out, well, was it supported or not? So you get discussion, and they usually state it in plain English, and it's really clear. This was supported, and this wasn't. So we had 4 hypotheses. The first 3 were supported, and the 4th was not supported, or the evidence was equivocal, right? Something like that. And often, what you'll do when you're reading discussion is you'll flip kind of back to the results and be going back and forth. Okay, they said this. Now, what were the numbers that justify that? So if they say in the discussion section, men ate more tacos than women. Right? Now I'm going to be going back to the results section and trying to find, okay, somewhere in here there's a test that compared these 2 groups on that variable. There should be some sort of t-test or a ANOVA, or maybe a chi-square if it's frequency data, but there's something that's going to say this was bigger than this. This mean was bigger than this mean, or this number was bigger than this number, and it was significant at this level. Right? And I should be able to find that for everything in discussion, there should be a matching thing in the results section. The other thing you want to be looking for are how are the inconsistencies explained. If not all the results are consistent with the hypotheses, and typically they're not, why didn't they find what they expected? Right? And that's usually where some of the really interesting stuff is. Related to that usually is they should be describing any flaws or limitations to the study, because no study is done perfectly. It would be too expensive and take much too long to do a perfect study. So there's always some limitations, and you want to see what those limitations are. That way, if you're going to be citing this article and talking about the conclusions, oh, well, they found this is true. You want to be careful how you say that if there are significant limitations. So this has been found to be true when, or in this group of people, this is true. So people who are maybe, if you're talking about some finding out kids with autistic spectrum disorders, and only people in the study were kids with Asperger's and not autistic disorder, then you want to say, okay, this treatment was found to be effective with autism spectrum kids that were fairly high functioning, right? And not just say, oh, this treatment's effective for autism, which is kind of a gross generalization of that finding, and that study may not support that statement. Okay, so know what the limitations are. And then also, what's the takeaway message, right? What's the main idea? And most authors will clearly identify this near the end of the discussion. And they'll say something like, our primary conclusion, our main conclusion was whatever. right? And that's pretty easy to find. And then the last thing that they'll do, which is often helpful for generating research ideas especially, is identifying what's next, right? What future research should be conducted. Okay, so that's kind of step by step, section by section, what to look for. Now, overall, when doing your literature review, what should you be looking for across sections? Well, one thing, did somebody else look at your question? And if they did, you can still do your study as long as there's something different about your study, right? Something different about the method, usually, or possibly different prediction. Maybe you're predicting the opposite of what they found, and then you have to justification for that. The only time you would do close to the same study is if you're doing a replication, which is also sometimes justified and important to do. But usually, even when we do a replication, we add at least one more wrinkle. That way, we're contributing more to the research base. But so, did they look at my question? And often, somebody has, but not exactly the same way you're looking at it. But you want to know, okay, well, what were their predictions, and what was the rationale for their predictions? Did they expect the same answer that I'm looking for, or did they expect the opposite? And I might want to use some of the same rationale for my predictions. Now, if you do that, because you're going to be pulling this a lot from the intro, you can't cite this author saying, well, you can, but don't. You can't say, don't say, Smith and Jones said that Barnes and Vasquez said, he said, she said. It's too confusing. And there is a way to do that with APA style using secondary citations. Better if they, if Smith and Jones cited something with Barnes and Vasquez, go find the Barnes and Vasquez article, read it for yourself, make sure it says what Smith and Jones said it says, and then you say it, right? And you don't have to cite Smith unless you're citing their reasoning. If it's just what they said, somebody else said, you can go find that other article and just say that thing. Now, if Smith and Jones said Barnes and Vasquez's article provides support for hypothesis because blah blah blah, and they kind of build this bridge between find the Barnes and Vasquez findings and the hypothesis. Now that's Smith and Jones's idea, and you need to cite Smith and Jones for that. But if it's just talking about somebody's finding, read that article, cite that finding directly yourself. Okay. What did they find? Did they find what I'm expecting to find, or the opposite? Either way, will the ways in which my study is different than theirs result in a different outcome for me? And you want to be thinking about those things. Looking at their method, might I want to do some of the same things they did in designing my study? And whether or not you have to cite another study for that depends on how much you use. If it's like, they did an experiment, yeah, I think I'll do an experiment too. You don't have to cite that. But if they use some sort of particular paradigm that was unique to their study, or certain materials, they showed people pictures of faces of people that looked that were of the same ethnicity or different ethnicity, and then also varied whether or not the people in the pictures were smiling or frowning. They did something like that, and you're going to do that exact same thing, but then look at a different dependent variable. You want to cite them for using their method, right? Because that's getting kind of specific into, well, they did these pictures with smiling and the frowning and different ethnicities. If you got the idea from them for that, then you cite them in the method section. But if they used 500 people, and you go, I think 500 sounds good, you don't have to cite them for that type of thing. Okay. Similarly, in the results section, might I want to do some of the same things they did? So they used this analytic procedure. That sounds like a good idea. And again, you don't typically have to cite for that unless it's a new analytic procedure that they came up with. If they did ANOVA and you said ANOVA sounds good, then you can just do ANOVA without having to cite that you got the idea for doing ANOVA by reading some other article. Other things that you're looking for when looking for articles are articles that will support your argument for the importance of your question. Right? So maybe you want to do a study looking at the treatment for PTSD. That means that in addition to looking for studies that have looked at the treatment of PTSD, right, that's one group of articles I'm looking at, I'm also going to be looking for a stack of articles that identify the negative effects of PTSD. What's associated with having PTSD? What are the kind of negative outcomes? Right? Because I've got to say, and then I also want to look at what's the prevalence of PTSD. So I've got to, this is important to look at this treatment because a lot of people have it and it causes these bad things. And I can't just say it causes bad things. I need to find some research where people have documented the negative associations between PTSD and marital outcome, physical health, whatever else. Right? And then you'll also be looking for some articles, some sources that are going to prop up your support for your hypothesis, your rationale. And a lot of times your rationale is based on, well, I think I'll find it with this group because somebody else found it with this group. And so it'll be articles that, again, looked at basically your question just in a different way. But sometimes not. Sometimes, especially if you're using a theory to support your hypothesis, you're going to have to find articles that tested that theory. So I'm using this theory to justify this, and this theory has been supported here, here, and here. Right? And this is where finding articles to support your rationale is where a lot of the creativity comes in, and where you really have a chance to do some original thinking and fill in gaps and create bridges between ideas that maybe nobody else has noticed or made before. Okay. Hope that's helpful. That's all for now. Take care.